Uh, Hi. Well, today I just aim to discuss my main thesis, which is a work in progress. So it'll just be some of my sort of preliminary findings, and I'm just kind of looking at what role the idea and the construction of extremism play in the policing of dissent in the UK today. So there's some nice pictures to go with me talking. From the literature that I've been looking at, police has historically focused on disorder and subjects who are marked as disorderly. So if we look at the work of Neoclaus and Scraton, they both see policing as a state function that is there to produce and reproduce order, and specifically the current social order, which in our case is that of a capitalist liberal democracy. A large part of the policing function is the administration of poverty and the mobilization of a workforce, and the police apparatus, which is intent on the fabrication of useful subjects and docile bodies, which would eliminate threats to the socio-economic order in the state. So if we look at the liberal ideology, disorder is equated to insecurity, so policing can be seen as securing the state. If we take this as a rationale behind police, then it comes as no surprise that this is a history of constructing radical social movements as a threat. And today we can see that the label of extremism is used to justify state responses, whilst historically labels such as insurgent or fanatic have been used. And if we look at Toscano's work, he kind of sees that these constructions are used to legitimize an enemy's political stand, by placing the group or the individual outside the frame of political rationality. And it also further implies that a fanatic, the so-called fanatic, is possessed by violent conviction, and that their extreme radical political views are therefore outside the domain of negotiation, which denies conversation to that group. So Toscano argues that behaviors which are stigmatized as fanatical are often tied to emancipatory politics. For example, the slavery abolitionist movement was deemed to be fanatical at their time, and today, within today's liberal democracies, the capitalist order and the things which are associated with it, such as free trade, human rights, democracy, these are seen as real freedoms and are therefore depoliticized, so that those that are against the status quo are seen as against these ultimate freedoms, and they are automatically placed outside the realm of rationality because they cannot be rational. And this kind of plays with Fukuyama's theory around the end of history, because it's the end of questioning the form and the role of the economy. And if we look, especially post 9/11, which is focused on national security, the only legitimate forms of political dialogue are those that kind of use the language of liberal democracy and are defined by these Western values. Everything else is said to be extreme, radical, and you cannot critique things like tolerance and human rights without being a terrorist. So that all counter-hegemonic movements are kind of placed in the same side, and they are terrorists because they are a threat to liberal democracy, and therefore terrorism is defined through an unwillingness to share the liberal state's worldview. So here we see a tension where, according to this, we cannot tolerate those which are intolerant. When I say we, it's we, of our values, because it would threaten those values, such as tolerance. So if we see national security as pivotal to the official representation of extremism and the subsequent policing of political activity, it is a key aspect of the mainstream narrative on this topic. Depoliticizing security as an ultimate need and good, and depoliticizing the issues that people protest about automatically disqualifies the validity of radical politics, and it strips security of the political dynamic which it has, which aids the legitimation of policing measures and also like pacifies the population from protesting. So I've kind of been looking at these sources, so I'm doing a discourse analysis of official discourse, and that includes Home Office documents and websites, some leaked files from WikiLeaks, and talks by like British Prime Minister and Home Secretary in the UK. I'll mainly be talking about the kind of like the first things. I've looked at all of them, but I'll mainly be talking about the first things today because of time and because those are the things that I've looked at the most. So the prevent strategy, channel and contest, they're kind of focused around the war on terror, but I kind of see that as laying the foundation for that, and the ideas that are then applied to any other group, such as protest, which is what I want to focus on. So I see the discursive construction of a group or an individual in these terms will impact their subsequent policing. So if we look at the construction of the Muslim population in these documents, in these counter-terrorism documents such as Prevent, Contest and Channel, we can see how this group of potential extremists has been placed outside the realm of rationality through its construction and the use of language within these documents. So for example, extremists are said to be taking advantage of vulnerable people who then fall into radicalization. So there's an implication here that these people don't have an agency or sanity to adhere to these political views, and these are not valid political views, and that it is the state's role to save them from themselves and from this radicalization. So also this extremists in these documents is blatantly racialized, as indicators of radicalizations include things such as growing a beard or dress, which doesn't explicitly say what, but it could be interpreted as traditional clothing or hijab. So the prevent strategy is presented as an integration program. That's how it's presented, and it is saying that through this program, Muslims, and especially young Muslims, should be educated in so-called British values. And it kind of gives a very specific interpretation of Islam. And Islamic extremists are described by these official sources as adhering to a misinterpretation of Islam, because obviously the British state must know that. You could see this as an attempt to redefine the Muslim identity as something more acceptable to the state, since, and I'm quoting here, those who see a conflict between being British and their own cultural identity may be prone to violent extremism. So in order to achieve this, within the documents, community leaders are called upon to speak out and to condemn extremism, which could be seen as a demand for loyalty from British subjects specifically. And there's a huge stress on the need for a moderate Islam. It has been argued by Kanani that this is a strategy to label Muslim dissent of government policy as extreme. And there's also a strong focus on school and universities, which should be open platforms, but are now pressured in picking specific speakers. So if Kanani especially looks at this in his work Spooked, and he shows how specifically Muslim speakers are banned from these platforms. But as the document says, they don't want to change the law, but they still want to combat extremism in all areas. So they're kind of surpassing the law, which is another key aspect of the literature. It is to prevent radicalization and terrorism, and prevent something which is yet to happen. Because of this, their focus is not on crimes or violence, but it's very obviously focused on the ideology. So they are policing ideology, which is supposed to lead to extremism. And this is an ideology which apparently is not consistent with British values, and it's all about identifying vulnerability through indicators and assessing risk. And this risk assessment within Channel, the document Channel, firstly pathologizes the group in question by dictating specialist support is needed through experts, and secondly avoids giving any clarity as to what extremism actually is. So for example, where they talk about assessing whether an individual is falling into extremism, they say that one is supposed to observe whether they keep company of extremists, whether their behavior seems to be increasingly centered around extremist ideology, or whether they possess extremist material and literature. So that, and throughout the sources which I looked at, so if we look at websites, like there's a few policing websites, like official ones, like the National Domestic Extremism Unit or the Home Office. There's a consistency of avoiding defining this term which is used together, like domestic extremism is just thrown around together with other powerful words such as values, solid tolerance, freedom of speech. And the most concrete definitions that they have are domestic extremism relates to the activity of groups or individuals who commit or plan serious criminal activity motivated by a political or an ideological viewpoint. And that's from the National Domestic Extremism Unit. And the Home Office in 2010 described extremism as the uncompromising rejection of the principle of the rule of law and the authority of any elected government in the country. So they don't really say anything to me, and apart from being a bit harsh and not really democratic. And other strong themes that can be observed within these documents are those of security, nationalism, and capitalism. So, for example, the security strategy is very much stressing a state of emergency, and that can be seen through language such as like saying that we are in an age of uncertainty, and terrorism is often equated to like natural disasters or world poverty, so something that we're helpless at, that's just there, that the country needs to be prepared for, this strong Britain, so that's very nationalist and exclusive in its own ways. But I see like this unpredictable enemy to be constructed to inspire fear in the population, and the response is to secure the country, secure the nation, secure the state. And this fear narrative justifies it justifies security measures, and it's just very flaky. I mean, they're saying things like Al-Qaeda is weaker now, but we mustn't let our guard down. So it's sort of like, regardless what happens, we're always going to be in a state of emergency. And the language, just the themes in the language, there's a large focus on economy and financial stability. So, and because that is what secures the state, and that's what will secure a strong Britain. They say stuff like value for money is a very corporate language is being used, and I see all this to kind of like come together and to contribute to like this us and them mentality and excluding people. But yeah, so as I said, I started my analysis looking at the Prevent and the Contest documents because the construction of Islamic extremism has laid the foundation for mobilizations for other extremist strategies against other dissenting groups. So I'd say that now protest, as has been mentioned in many other papers today, is being increasingly framed as a legitimate, and the approach to it has been increasingly authoritarian, increasingly restricted. I mean, firstly, it has to be peaceful, but more on top of that, it's not just a demand for peaceful protests, but any protest which disrupt the community is seen as illegitimate, but that's pretty much what protest is designed to do. in official discourses around protest, there's a strong focus on private property and profit. So, for example, on the MI5's own website, it says animal extremists are said to be known to attack property. And I think, as it has been mentioned by other papers today, a current example of a state response to resistance is the policing of the anti-fracking movement in the UK. Is that my next slide? I'm not actually sure. Yes, it is. 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, environmental and animal rights activists have a history of being framed as radical and extreme. And Salter, for example, argued that this is because their approach, their direct action, does directly impact profit through actions such as like liberating animals or stopping fracking, in this case in the UK. So this is from a document published in 2011 by the Association of Chief Police Officers, and it's part of a guideline to police the anti-fracking movement. And I think this is really interesting because, for example, there's a level of acceptable behavior, and I mean they even include opposition to fracking in it. I mean that you're opposed to fracking is included in this. And activism is criminal, apparently. They don't really see what activism is, but there is in the document kind of hints at the fact that there is damage to property being involved, so I guess that's criminal, but you know. But yeah, so this kind of official discourse together with like violent policing at protests kind of sends out this clear message that protesting is not legitimate and it's not safe, which also contributes to people self-policing their own politics, which is why I think this is a problem. And why is this a problem? I think why this is a problem can be summarized by what has been said by the British Prime Minister shortly after his re-election, which I think this is quite a scary quote. For too long, we have been a passively tolerant society. I'm sure most of you have heard this already. Saying to our citizens, as long as you obey the law, we will leave you alone. It's often meant we have stood neutral between different values, and that's helped foster a narrative of extremism and grievance. This government will conclusively turn the page on this failed approach. In addition to that, the government says in its contest strategy that this includes non-violent extremism. So it seems that this extremism that isn't really defined is not about violence and is not about legality. So what is it about? And Cameron does add, as a party of one nation, we will govern as one nation and bring our country together. That means actively promoting certain values. This is regarding this new counter-extremism bill, which will ban people from gathering and expressing their opinions, because these harmful activities are defined as risks to be a threat to the functioning economy. So who is excluded from this one nation? Why? Whose voice has been silenced? Are questions that are raised in my research. So I'm raising questions rather than really making a point today. But I also think that who defines these British values is important. And the lack of definition around what extremism is does mean that this can be applied to anyone. And anyone who does dissent government policy can be criminalized very easily, especially through the new legislation that they're passing through. And they do not seem to be able to define what extremism is. So, for example, if we look at an interview with Theresa May on BBC4, where she was defending this new counter-extremism bill, she was asked, so what is extremism? And she started saying, I'm quoting, extremism that is like Nazism, that is seeking to promote hatred and divide our society and undermine our value. And then she was pressed and she said, once we put this bill through, we will ensure to have a definition. We've set out a definition of extremism at the moment. We're trying to deal with those in our society actively promoting extremism. So, leaving aside that this is not a very articulate answer from the UK Home Secretary, it seems to be clear that it is in an elitist interest not to define this term, but simply to assign an emotional and strong connotation to it, and anyone can be labelled an extremist, basically. And yeah, I see this as a problem because all criticism of the social order are seen as extreme. This eliminates political opposition, gradually creating a society where dissent is illegitimate, and all this is sort of hidden behind the veil of national security. So yeah, that's me done.